This incident is from Blackwood Pines, a secluded, fog-shrouded mountain town deep in the Pacific Northwest. There is a forbidden law etched into the rotted bark of the deepest woods: never answer a voice that calls your name after the sun has vanished. The mimic does not hunt with claws or teeth, it hunts with the love you carry in your heart. It will whisper with the tongue of your mother, your child, or your spouse. It will call you once to pique your curiosity, twice to stir your soul, and a third time to lead you into the crushing dark. Only the fourth call is human. But by then, for most, the silence is already eternal. My name is Julian Vance. As a surgeon, I've spent my life cutting through the mysteries of the human body, believing that every ailment has a biological cause and every death has a clinical explanation. I used to laugh at the stories my patients told, tales of shadow figures and deathbed visitors. I thought the mind was simply misfiring under the stress of trauma. But after what happened in Blackwood Pines, I realized that science is nothing more than a fragile candle we hold up against a darkness that is far older and hungrier than we can imagine. "Are you sure about this, Jules?" Elena asked, leaning her head against the window of our SUV as we crested the final ridge before the descent into the valley. I glanced over at her. The late afternoon sun was a bruised purple behind the thick blanket of fog. The cabin has been in my family for 3 generations, L. My grandfather swore by the air up here. He lived to be 94. A month away from the hospital, no pagers, no emergency consults, it's exactly what we need. Elena looked out at the wall of trees pressing against the shoulder of the road. It's beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. It feels like the forest is watching us. That's just the lack of city noise, I joked, though a small, cold knot of unease tightened in my gut. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "We'll be at the cabin in 20 minutes. I'll get a fire going, and we can finally start our anniversary properly." We arrived at the cabin, a sprawling, dark-timbered structure built into the side of a granite cliff, just as the light failed completely. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. As I unloaded the suitcases, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the neighboring property, about 50 yards away. It was an older woman, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She stood perfectly still, watching us. "Evening," I called out, trying to be neighborly. The woman didn't move for a long moment. Then, she walked slowly toward the edge of the gravel drive. "You the Vance boy? Arthur's grandson?" "That's me. Julian. And this is my wife, Elena." The woman's eyes were sharp, darting between us. "I'm Martha. I looked after the place for your father before he passed. Listen to me, Julian. The woods are restless this time of year. The fog brings things down from the high peaks. We'll be fine, Martha," I said with a polite, dismissive smile. "We've got plenty of supplies." Martha stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It's not food you need to worry about. It's the calls. If you hear someone calling you from outside, even if it sounds like your wife, even if it sounds like me, you stay inside. You wait. If they call you 3 times, you keep your mouth shut. Only if they call a 4th time is it safe to answer. Do you understand? I felt Elena stiffen beside me. What do you mean, safe to answer? She asked. The mimic, Martha said, her eyes wide. It's been hungry lately. It took the Miller boy last week. Found him in the creek with his lungs full of silt and not a mark on him. He followed his father's voice right into the deep water. But his father was 10 miles away in town. Martha, that's a tragic accident, I'm sure, I said, my clinical brain immediately dismissing the local folklore. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations. But thank you for the warning. Martha stared at me, a look of profound pity on her face. Science won't save you when the fog talks back, doctor. She turned and vanished back into the trees without another word. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with dust and history. I spent an hour getting the generator hummed to life and the wood stove roaring. By 10 p.m., the isolation felt cozy rather than oppressive. We shared a bottle of wine, the firelight dancing against the dark wood walls. She was creepy, Elena said, tucked under a blanket on the sofa. The way she looked at us, like she was seeing our ghosts. Small-town superstition, I said, though I found myself checking the locks on the heavy oak door twice. They feed on these stories to keep life interesting. It's just a local legend to keep kids from wandering into the woods at night. We went to bed shortly after. The silence of the mountain was absolute, a heavy, ringing quiet that made every creak of the cabin sound like a footstep. I fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, the kind that only comes after months of 80-hour work weeks. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. The fire had died down to a dull orange glow. The room was freezing. Beside me, Elena was fast asleep, her breathing slow and rhythmic. I sat up, rubbing my face, wondering what had jolted me awake. Then, I heard it. Julian, it came from outside, somewhere near the porch. The voice was soft, slightly muffled by the fog, but it was unmistakable. It was Elena's voice. It had the exact same lilt, the same slight rasp she had when she was tired. Julian, please. I'm locked out, it's so cold, my heart skipped a beat. I instinctively reached out to the other side of the bed to wake her, but my hand hit the empty, cold sheets. Elena was gone. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I scrambled out of bed, my feet hitting the icy floorboards. Elena. I whispered. Julian, help me. I can't open the door, the voice called again from just outside the bedroom window. I rushed to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The fog was a thick, swirling wall of white against the glass. I couldn't see the porch, couldn't see the trees. I could only see the reflection of my own terrified face. I turned and ran toward the front door. "Elena. I'm coming." I reached for the heavy iron bolt, my fingers trembling. I was about to slide it back when a cold realization hit me. If she was outside, how did she get out? I had locked the door from the inside. The windows were all latched. I looked back toward the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. A faint light was coming from under the door of the guest bathroom. I froze, my hand still on the bolt. "Elena." I called out, my voice cracking. The bathroom door slowly creaked open. Elena stepped out, rubbing her eyes, wearing her thick flannel robe. "Jules. Why are you shouting? What are you doing at the door?" The blood drained from my face. I looked back at the front door. "Julian, why won't you answer me?" The voice from the porch called out a third time. It was her voice. Identical. Perfect. But Elena was standing 5 feet in front of me, her face filled with confusion. "Julian, what is that?" she whispered, her eyes widening as she heard her own voice coming from the darkness outside. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my chest like a sledgehammer. The third call. Martha's warning screamed in my mind. If they call you 3 times, you keep your mouth shut. We stood in absolute, paralyzed silence. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, the oxygen turning to lead. We waited for the 4th call. 10 seconds passed. 20. A minute. Nothing. The voice didn't come again. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the call. It felt heavy, expectant, as if something was pressed against the other side of the oak door, listening to our heartbeats. "Julian," Elena breathed, her voice a tiny thread of sound. That was me. How was that me? "I don't know," I whispered, gripping the 4-pole, no, the heavy fire poker, from the hearth. "Stay behind me." I walked slowly to the window beside the door and wiped the condensation away. I shined my heavy tactical flashlight out into the fog. The beam of light struggled to pierce the white haze. But for a split second, the fog shifted. Standing on the edge of the porch, just inches from the glass, was a figure. It was wearing Elena's blue coat. It had her height, her build. But as the light hit its face, my stomach turned over. It didn't have a face. Where the eyes and nose should have been, there was only smooth, pale, undifferentiated skin, like a blank canvas stretched too tight over a skull. Its mouth was a jagged, horizontal slit that looked like it had been carved with a dull knife. The thing turned its head slightly, sensing the light. Then, it didn't run. It didn't scream. It slowly began to mimic the motion of Elena rubbing her eyes, perfectly duplicating her mannerisms from moments ago. And then, it spoke. But it didn't use its mouth. The voice seemed to vibrate out of its very skin. "Julian, it's so cold, let me in." It was the fourth call. But it wasn't a question. It was a command. Suddenly, the heavy oak door didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a thin sheet of paper. From the darkness of the woods behind the cabin, a dozen more voices began to rise, all of them calling my name, all of them using the voices of people I had lost. My father. My grandmother. A patient I had lost on the table 3 years ago. The mimic on the porch leaned its blank, featureless head against the glass. "I can hear your heart, Julian," it whispered in Elena's voice. "It sounds so delicious." Terror of the fourth call isn't just that it sounds human, it's that it sounds too human. It carries a vibration that bypasses the ears and resonates directly in the prefrontal cortex, triggering a primal surrender. My medical mind tried to categorize the sound as a frequency-based hallucination, a byproduct of the extreme atmospheric pressure and the isolation. But when that featureless thing on the porch pressed its pale, wet skin against the glass, the cold hard truth was that no textbook in the world could explain the nightmare standing 3 inches away. "Julian, get away from the window." Elena's voice was a jagged shard of panic. She was backed against the kitchen counter, clutching a heavy cast-iron skillet, her knuckles white. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was staring into the void where its eyes should have been. The thing began to change. Its skin rippled like liquid wax, the blank surface of its face twitching as if something underneath was trying to punch its way through. It began to mimic the sound of the heavy iron bolt on the door sliding open. Clack. Slide. Click. The sound was perfect. My hand instinctively reached for the handle, convinced the door was already unlocked. "Julian, no. It's a trick." Elena screamed, lunging forward and grabbing my arm, yanking me back just as the glass in the window began to vibrate with a high-pitched, harmonic hum. The mimic didn't break the glass. It began to sing. It was a chorus of 100 voices, men, women, children, all screaming in perfect, synchronized harmony. The sound was so loud it felt like my eardrums were being pierced by needles. I collapsed to my knees, covering my ears, but the sound was inside my head. Then, the lights in the cabin flared a brilliant, blinding white before exploding in a spray of glass and sparks. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Elena, where are you?" I roared, reaching out blindly into the black. "I'm here. I'm right here." I felt her hand grab mine, but the skin was freezing. It was like touching a piece of raw, refrigerated meat. I pulled my hand back, a cold spike of dread hitting my heart. "Elena. Talk to me," I whispered. "I'm right here, Julian, help me, it's so cold." The voice came from the left. But the hand that had just touched me was on the right. I fumbled for the tactical flashlight in my pocket and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the dust-filled air. Standing in the corner of the kitchen was Elena, her back to me, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But directly beside me, crouched on top of the dining table, was the thing from the porch. It had somehow entered the cabin without a sound. It was perched like a gargoyle, its limbs elongated and spindly, its pale skin glowing in the flashlight beam. It didn't have Elena's coat anymore. It was naked, its ribs protruding, its skin covered in a layer of translucent slime. It had no face, but it was looking directly at me. It reached out a long, three-jointed finger and touched the side of my neck. Its touch felt like an ice cube being pressed against my jugular. "Julian, you have such a beautiful voice," it whispered, using a perfect mimicry of my own father's voice. "I think I'll take it." Get away from him. The real Elena lunged forward, swinging the heavy skillet with everything she had. The iron caught the entity squarely in its ribcage with a sickening, hollow thud. The thing was tossed off the table, hitting the wall with a wet splat. It let out a sound like a mechanical hard drive crashing, a screeching, digital static that tore through the room, before it scrambled up the wall and into the shadows of the rafters. "The car. Now!" I shouted, grabbing Elena's hand, the warm one this time, and sprinting for the back door. We burst out into the night. The fog was so thick I couldn't see my own feet. The air was alive with voices. From the tree-line, a child was crying for its mother. A man was screaming for help from the bottom of a well that didn't exist. It was a symphony of decoys. We reached the SUV. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them into the mud. "Julian, hurry!" Elena was looking back at the cabin. The thing was standing on the roof, its silhouette jagged against the moonless sky. I snatched the keys, dove into the driver's seat, and slammed the door. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned. Crank. Crank. Silence. No, no, no. Come on. I hammered the steering wheel. The dashboard lights flickered, but the engine was dead. It wasn't a mechanical failure. I could feel a heavy, low-frequency vibration humming through the frame of the car. The mimics weren't just sound thieves, they were disrupting the very physics of the area. "Look." Elena pointed at the windshield. Emerging from the fog were three more figures. They walked with a hitching, unnatural gait, their limbs moving in ways that defied human anatomy. They were all wearing the clothes of people from the town, a flannel shirt, a sheriff's deputy uniform, a yellow raincoat. But they were all featureless. All blank. One of them, the one in the deputy uniform, walked up to the driver's side window. It leaned in, its blank face inches from mine. "Registration and insurance, please," it said in a perfect, polite lawman's drawl. It was a recording of a memory, replayed through a monster. I shifted the car into neutral and let it roll down the steep gravel driveway. Hold on. The SUV gained momentum, bouncing over rocks and roots. We drifted blindly through the fog, the engine silent, the only sound the gravel crunching under the tires and the deputy running alongside the car at 30 miles per hour, its blank face never leaving the window. We hit the main road and I steered into the skid, the car picking up speed as we descended toward the valley floor. The deputy finally fell behind, its voice fading into a distorted loop. Have a nice day. We have to go to Martha's, Elena gasped, clutching her seatbelt. She knew. She's the only one who knew. Her cabin is just around the next bend, I said, my eyes strained against the whiteout of the fog. We saw the flicker of candlelight through the trees a moment later. Martha's cabin was smaller, built of heavy cedar logs and surrounded by a strange, shimmering perimeter of what looked like broken mirrors and iron stakes. I steered the SUV into her yard and we bolted for the porch. Martha. Open up. It's Julian. I pounded on the door. The door creaked open just an inch. A single, terrified I peered out. Did you answer them? She hissed. We heard them, but we didn't follow. Martha grabbed my shirt and hauled us inside, slamming the door and sliding 3 heavy iron bolts into place. The interior of her cabin was a chaotic museum of the occult. Every inch of the walls was covered in salt circles, ancient maps of the Pacific Northwest, and rows upon rows of jars filled with what looked like human hair and fingernails. You're lucky to be breathing, Martha said, her voice trembling as she lit a fresh bundle of sage. The mimics, the voice eaters, they're not just spirits. They are the leftovers of something that lived here before the mountains were even formed. They don't have souls of their own, so they harvest ours. One sound at a time. What happened to the Miller boy? Elena asked, sitting on a wooden stool, her eyes darting to the windows. He answered the third call, Martha said, staring into the fire. When you answer them, you give them a piece of your identity. By the third time, they own your voice. By the fourth, they own your body. They hollow you out from the inside, eating your memories, your personality, until there's nothing left but a blank skin for them to inhabit. My father's voice. I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The thing at the cabin. It used my father's voice. That means it's already eaten someone who knew him, Martha said, looking at me with pity. It's gathering power, Julian. It doesn't just want a meal. It wants a legacy. It wants someone with influence. Someone people trust. Suddenly, a loud, official knock echoed through the door. Sheriff Miller. Open up. I know you're in there, Martha. The voice was booming, authoritative, and completely human. Don't, Martha warned, raising a hand. Martha, it's me. I've got a deputy with me. We found a stalled SUV in the road. I moved toward the door. It's the sheriff, Martha. We saw him in town earlier. We need his help. Julian, stop. Elena grabbed my arm. Wait for the fourth call. We stood in the flickering candlelight. Martha, this is an official police matter. Open this door or I'm kicking it in. The sheriff's voice was getting angry. 2. Julian. Are you in there? It's Miller. We found your wife's ID in the car. 3. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the iron bolt. My clinical mind was screaming that this was the law, that we were safe. But my soul was screaming that the man on the other side of that door was a hollow shell. Then, the silence returned. A long, agonizing minute passed. Julian. The voice came again. It was softer this time. More desperate. Please. I'm so cold out here. The fog is coming for me. 4. It's him, I breathed, relief washing over me. He called 4 times. Martha said the fourth call is human. I reached for the bolt and slid it back. I threw the door open, ready to pull the sheriff inside. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Miller. He looked perfectly normal. His uniform was crisp, his badge was shining in the moonlight, and he held a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Thank God, I said, stepping forward. Sheriff, you have to help us. There are things in the woods. I stopped. The sheriff wasn't blinking. He was staring at me with a wide, fixed grin. Of course, Julian, Miller said. But as he spoke, I realized his lips weren't moving. The voice was coming from his chest. He tilted his head to the side, and the skin on his neck began to stretch. And stretch. And stretch. His neck grew to 3 feet long, winding like a serpent as his head hovered inches from mine. I'm so glad you answered, the sheriff's head whispered. Behind him, out of the fog, dozens of blank-faced figures emerged, all of them wearing the faces of the people I had seen in the town earlier. They weren't featureless anymore. They had stolen the faces of everyone in Blackwood Pines. And they were all looking at me. Martha. I screamed, but when I turned around, Martha was gone. Sitting on her stool was a blank, pale thing wearing her shawl, holding a bundle of sage that was burning with a thick, black, oily smoke. It looked at me and spoke with Martha's voice, but the tone was cold and dead. The fourth call isn't a safety check, Julian, the Martha thing said. It's the invitation. And you just let the whole world in. The blank-faced townspeople began to pour into the cabin, their voices a cacophony of my own deepest fears, all of them speaking at once, a tidal wave of sound designed to drown out my very soul. Elena screamed, but her voice was instantly snatched out of the air by a mimic standing behind her, who repeated the scream back to her in a perfect, mocking loop. We were surrounded. The science was gone. The logic was dead. There was only the hunger of the void, and the terrifying realization that my own voice was no longer mine. The sound of a human voice is produced by the vibration of vocal folds in the larynx, shaped by the throat, mouth, and tongue. It is a physical, biological process. But the sound filling Martha's cabin wasn't biological. It was a parasitic frequency, a vibration that felt like it was trying to peel the skin off my bones. The Sheriff Miller entity's head was still swaying on its 3-foot-long neck, its featureless face hovering just inches from mine. I could see the pores in its translucent skin, the way it pulsed with a faint, sickly light as it spoke. It wasn't breathing, it was simply outputting a perfect digital recreation of the sheriff's voice. "Julian," the neck creature whispered. "You have so much structure. So many memories to harvest." I backed away, tripping over a crate of old jars, my mind racing through the trauma of the last hour. Elena was pinned against the far wall by the thing wearing Martha's shawl. The Martha mimic was leaning in close to her, its jaw unhinging just like the thing at our cabin. It wasn't biting her. It was inhaling. I could see a faint, shimmering vapor being pulled from Elena's open, screaming mouth. Her very voice was being sucked out of her lungs. "Stop it!" I roared, swinging the heavy iron fire poker I had snatched from the hearth. I swung with every ounce of surgical precision I possessed. The iron bar connected with the side of the sheriff mimic's elongated neck. There was no sound of breaking bone. Instead, there was a sickening, wet squelch, like hitting a bag of heavy jelly. The entity's head whipped around 3 times, the neck coiling like a garden hose, but it didn't fall. It simply absorbed the impact. "Violence is such a loud emotion," the Miller thing said, its voice now distorting, blending the sheriff's baritone with the high-pitched giggle of a child. "We like the loud ones. They stay fresh longer." The blank-faced townspeople were now inside the cabin, their bodies twitching in a horrific, synchronized dance. They weren't touching us yet. They were forming a circle, their featureless heads tilted toward the ceiling, their mouths opening in unison. A wall of white noise hit me. It was the sound of thousands of voices, whispers, screams, lullabies, death rattles, all layered on top of each other. It was a sensory execution. I felt my vision start to blur. My balance failed. The clinical, rational world of Dr. Julian Vance was being erased by a tidal wave of stolen sound. The mirrors. The voice was faint, barely audible over the static. It was Elena. She was sliding down the wall, her face pale, her eyes rolling back. She was pointing at the heavy cedar walls of the cabin. I looked up. Among the jars of hair and salt circles, Martha had mounted dozens of small, jagged pieces of broken mirror. They were angled toward the center of the room, hidden behind old burlap sacks. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning. The mimics had no form. They were empty vessels that survived by imitating what they saw and heard. Martha hadn't used mirrors for vanity. She had used them as a defensive ward. I lunged for the nearest burlap sack and ripped it down. A jagged, silver shard was revealed. I grabbed the heavy tactical flashlight from my belt and aimed the beam directly into the glass. The light hit the mirror and shattered into 1,000 brilliant rays, reflecting back at the circle of monsters. The effect was instantaneous. The mimic wearing the deputy's uniform caught its own reflection in the light. It froze. Its skin began to bubble and pop as it tried to imitate the reflection of its own featureless, blank face. It was a feedback loop. A predator trying to prey on its own emptiness. The entity let out a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once. Its body began to fold in on itself, its limbs snapping and twisting as it tried to mimic the jagged edges of the broken mirror. Julian. All of them. Elena choked out. I went into a frenzy. I ignored the pain in my ribs, ignored the voices of my dead father and my lost patient screaming in my ears. I sprinted around the room, tearing down every burlap sack, uncovering every mirror Martha had hidden. The cabin became a kaleidoscope of blinding light and shattered reflections. The Miller thing shrieked, its elongated neck lashing out wildly as it tried to avoid the mirrors. But the light was everywhere. Every time it looked at a shard, it lost a piece of the identity it had stolen. Its sheriff's uniform dissolved into gray, gelatinous slime. Its voice broke apart, turning into a meaningless, guttural hum. I grabbed a large, handheld mirror from Martha's vanity and turned it toward the Martha mimic that was hovering over Elena. "Look at yourself," I screamed. The entity turned. It saw its blank, horrific face in the glass. The creature's jaw snapped shut. It let out a high-frequency whistle that cracked the glass in my hand. Its body began to smoke, the stolen identity of the old woman burning away like paper in a furnace. "No. No. We are you." The voices whispered, now thin and pathetic. "You're nothing," I spat. The circle of townspeople began to melt. Their stolen clothes, their borrowed faces, their hijacked voices, all of it was being stripped away by the raw, uncompromising reality of the mirrors. They collapsed into heaps of pale, shivering flesh, their featureless heads bowing to the floor. I grabbed Elena, hauling her to her feet. "We have to go. Now, while they're confused." We didn't look back. We burst out of Martha's cabin into the freezing night. The fog was still there, but it felt thinner, less intentional. The voices in the trees had turned into a low, mourning drone. We ran for the SUV. I didn't care that the engine had been dead. I jammed the key into the ignition and screamed, "Start! Start, you piece of junk!" The low-frequency vibration that had been humming through the car was gone. Crank! Crank! Roar! The engine turned over, the headlights cutting through the white haze like two twin sabers of light. I shifted into gear and floored it. We tore down the mountain road, the tires screaming on the wet asphalt. I didn't slow down for the bends. I didn't slow down when I saw pale, featureless figures standing on the shoulder of the road, their hands raised in a mock hitchhiking gesture. We didn't stop until we hit the state highway, 30 miles away, under the bright, artificial glare of a 24-hour gas station. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands glued to the steering wheel, my chest heaving. Elena was slumped in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. "Elena," I whispered. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. I reached over and touched her shoulder. Her skin was warm. Her pulse was steady. But when she turned to look at me, her eyes were vacant. Hollow. "Elena, talk to me," I pleaded. She opened her mouth. Her throat moved. Her tongue shifted. But no sound came out. The Martha mimic had finished its work. It hadn't taken her life, but it had taken her voice. Every word she had ever spoken, every laugh, every whisper of "I love you," it was all gone. Stored inside a blank-faced monster back in the valley of Blackwood Pines. I quit my residency the following week. I sold the cabin for a fraction of its value. I took Elena to every specialist in the country, ENTs, neurologists, psychiatrists. They all told me the same thing: physical structures are intact. It must be psychological trauma. A rare form of selective mutism. But I know the clinical truth. There is a hole in her soul where her voice used to be. We live in a high-rise apartment in the center of Seattle now. It's loud. There are sirens, construction, the constant hum of millions of people. I need the noise. I need the sounds of a living city to drown out the silence I brought back from the mountains. But sometimes, late at night, when the city finally goes quiet for a few precious hours, I'll be sitting in the living room and I'll hear it. The sound of the balcony door sliding open. And then, a voice will call my name from the darkness outside, 40 stories above the ground. "Julian," it's Elena's voice. Her old voice. The one she used to have before the cabin. "Julian. I'm right here, why won't you answer me?" I never look. I never move. I sit in the dark, my eyes locked on the floor, counting the calls. 1, 2, 3. And then, the fourth call comes. "Julian, it's me. I promise. It's really me. Open the door." It sounds more human than the real Elena ever did. It carries the weight of our anniversary, the memory of our first date, the sound of our wedding vows. It is a perfect, clinical recreation of the woman I love. But I know the rule of Blackwood Pines. The fourth call isn't the safety check. It isn't the human signal. The fourth call is the invitation. And if I answer it, if I give it even a single word, I won't just lose my voice. I'll lose the doctor. I'll lose the husband. I'll lose the men. I sit in the silence, waiting for the sun to rise, knowing that somewhere out there, the silence is still hungry. And it's getting very, very good at pretending to be me.